Welcome to my 6-step roadmap to creating impactful visualizations in Tableau. First and foremost, thank you all so much for being here, both in person and online, and choosing to spend the next 40 minutes with me today. My name is Lisa Trescott. I am a research analyst at Miracosta College, which is actually a college that's just right here in San Diego, up in Oceanside. I'm also a Tableau visionary, a public ambassador, a tug leader, and back in 2021, I was the Iron Viz champion. And I also have a, thank you. I also have a website, lisatrescott.com, where I post a lot of tips, tricks, and tutorials, all things related to Tableau. It is also where I have posted a list of all of the things that I will mention in this presentation in terms of resources. So grab this QR code and rest assured that if I say, there are tools for this, or I like this tool, it will be linked in this blog post. And I'll put this up again at the end, too, in case you miss it now. OK, so we'll jump in, but before I do, just a bit of a trigger warning, because I think this first slide is going to strike fear in the hearts of a lot of analysts out there. OK, so you've been warned. Is a blank Tableau workbook. That sheet 1 staring back at you can be really overwhelming, because it represents endless possibilities of what this viz could become. And with endless possibilities come endless choices, endless pressure, right? Pressure to analyze the data well, make the right charts, find the right story, make it all look beautiful. And that is a bit of a tall order, right? And it can be daunting if you don't know where to start. But if you have a process in place, a 6-step process perhaps, this overwhelming and scary blank workbook can become more of an exciting blank canvas, right? Exciting about the endless possibilities that it holds. And that's really where I want to take you today. I want to show you how I like to go from here, this blank workbook, to a more completed viz. So this is the viz that I did back in 2021 for Iron Viz. It's all about breakthrough artists, looking at them through their Shazam data. And I will say this is very different than anything I would create at work, right? My coworkers here, they can attest to that. But the process I'm going to walk you through is universal. It applies to Iron Viz. It applies to community projects like Makeover Monday, Back to Viz Basics. It applies to your dashboards at work. So this process can be used for anything. So let's hit the road, right? Buckle up. We've got 6 steps to get through. So we're going to start at the first step, which is getting to know your topic. And this might sound really obvious, because I'm basically telling you, you need to know what you're talking about before you look at your data. But you do. You need to know what you're talking about. Early on in my career, I would jump into projects without really understanding fully what an industry or area was about. And those vizzes and dashboards are very ill-informed, right? Very obviously so, because they do not answer the right questions, because I didn't know the right questions to ask, right? So you definitely need to spend time getting to know what it is you're visualizing. And for me, that looks like a lot of research, right? So I spend tons of time contextualizing my data, right? Trying to understand what's been going on historically, currently, what's projected for the future for an industry or area. So a lot of time on Google, a lot of articles, a lot of blog posts to get to understand this. You also want to understand industry standards. You are not going to know if something's doing well or struggling unless you know what normal looks like in an industry, right? So you need to make sure you know that. That's also going to allow you to set appropriate goals and benchmarks when the time comes to analyze that data. And then you're going to need to talk to people. I know we're probably all introverted analysts, but you got to talk to people, especially people who have more knowledge than you. Raise your hand if you have ever worked at an organization where knowledge gets passed from person to person rather than written down. Yeah, I think all of us, right? It's very common. So you're going to have to talk to people. Find subject matter experts at your work. That's usually someone who's just been there longer than you, and find out as much as you can about your topic. The goal here is really to become an expert, or at least sound like one, right? At work, yes, please become an expert in your field. But if you do a Makeover Monday, you're probably not going to spend weeks in this area, right? You're not going to spend weeks understanding something just to do a quick quiz. So in that case, you need to know at least enough to sound like you know what you're talking about. Right, back in 2021, when I found out the topic for Iron Viz was the music industry, I just about had a heart attack, because I know nothing about the music industry. I am not hip when it comes to knowing what is trending and what's popular and what the kids are listening to. I remember over the summer, everyone was talking about a Brat Summer. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Who's Charlie XYZ? Like, what are you talking about? The music industry is not my thing. But you better believe I made it my thing for a couple of weeks, right? Because I did not want to get to the Iron Viz stage and look like I didn't know what I was talking about. So I was on tons of websites reading everything I could about the industry, what views and hits and streams and how those all played in, how that transformed over time. So that when I got up there I look knowledgeable, right? The other thing you want to do up top is you want to define who your audience is going to be. This is going to set the tone for everything that you look at. It's going to set the lens that you're going to look at all of your data and all of your analysis, because it's going to allow you to focus on your audience's needs. Different groups of people need different types of information, different levels of information, right? So make sure that you know who you're going to be presenting this to so that you can focus on that and define what pieces of information do they need in their hands to make a decision or take action or sometimes even just care about a problem, right? Defining them up top is really going to help you when it comes to analyzing, designing, and telling a story. So once you get to know your topic, you got to get to know your data. And I know, as analysts, at least for me, I get a fresh data set and I immediately want to jump in and I want to start analyzing it, right? I can't wait. But you got to pump the brakes a little bit. You have to make sure you know what you're working with before you get in to analyze it. So what that looks like is make sure you know your data sources, right? How is all that data collected? Is it hand entered? Is it a survey? Is it biometrics? Right? All those things are going to help you assess reliability of your data and understand what values mean when you come to look at them during your analysis. You also want to know if it's governed, how it's governed, is it maintained, who's maintaining those tables, and kind of all the business processes around those. So who's touching the data when and making decisions about the data. I work with financial aid data a lot, and I challenge you to find another data set with more business processes, right? Students can get state, local, federal, for now, aid. They can get grants, loans, scholarships, vouchers, fee waivers. They apply, they are awarded, they accept, it's dispersed. And every single one of those has different combinations of processes. And all of that affects what the data looks like. So make sure you understand those things about your data. You also want to know what you have at your disposal, right? So know your variables really well. If you can get your hands on a data element dictionary, that's going to be the gold standard. But as we just said, a lot of us work where things aren't written down, so it might not be there for you. You might have to do some legwork in this area to find out how are these variables defined. When I work at a college, we look at students' age all the time, and the annoying thing about age is it's always changing, right? A student could start a semester one age and end it a different age. So you need to know how is it defined, what time point are you going to use. You need to know your data types, right? String, numeric, date timestamp, they all are handled differently and store different information in Tableau. I recently worked on a project where I thought I knew the date timestamp. Turned out it was in UTC time, which is 8 hours different than Pacific time and 7 during daylight savings. So that was something I had to account for, or I would have been telling a department they serve 500 students at midnight, right? That didn't happen. They're not open then. So make sure you know your data types really well. And know your expected ranges, right? This is going to help you determine when you have outliers, potentially errors, right? Knowing what an expected range is for a variable. Again, going back to Iron Viz, we were told you have the top 200 songs that are Shazammed every day in this data set. So I took that knowledge and I was analyzing the data, and all of a sudden I was seeing tons of songs that were well above 200. And I thought, well, there goes my Iron Viz journey, right? Like, I clearly screwed up this analysis. No, it turned out that during that time frame, Shazam had been acquired. And prior to that acquisition, it was well above 200 songs. And after, it was just 200. So I had to make sure that I was keyed into things like that. Otherwise, I would have had a very different analysis with totally different songs and artists and potentially not an Iron Viz trophy, right? So just make sure you're aware of those things. And you need to know what you have in terms of variables, but it's also really important to know what you do not have, right? We probably have all been in a situation where we've been in a meeting and we've told someone, yes, I can get you that data. And then you go back to your desk and realize, I can't get them that data, right? That's not a good look. We want to avoid that. So make sure you know what you have access to so that you know what questions you can and can't answer for your stakeholders. And then you also just want to understand your tables. I cannot remember the last time I worked on a project that only used one table, so make sure you know how those tables relate to each other, right? All those primary and foreign keys are going to be paramount when it comes to joining up your data. You don't want to miss any of those, otherwise you're going to have some wonky results, right? And then just knowing the level of detail of your data. What does one row represent in your data, right? That's going to help you understand the level of granularity, and when the time comes to write your calculations, your LODs, this is going to come into play. And what I usually like to do for this is I just like to walk through a couple of random rows in my data. So I'll typically throw this into prep, and I'll just go through every column for like 10 to 20 rows so that I can get a better handle on this, especially when you don't have that data element dictionary. Okay, let's finally touch and play with our data, right? Let's analyze it and find a story in step 3. I am not planning on teaching anyone here how to analyze data today. I'm pretty sure you probably all have that skill. What I'm going to focus on is how I like to analyze data with the idea of trying to find a story in it. And with that in mind, I start every project by generating just a giant list of questions, right? So they might be fact-based. They might be, how many students enrolled in a course. They might be more relationships or trends, right? Does enrolling in this course relate to graduating on time? They might be more comparative. How are older students doing in a course compared to younger students? All of these questions are going to help you explore the data with a purpose, right? Now at work, the majority of these questions are likely going to be generated by your stakeholders, right? They usually come to us because they have a question. But we just established we know the data really well. We know it better than our stakeholders. So there's never a time when a stakeholder brings me a question that I don't add additional questions to it, right? Because I know, hey, we have data that might add clarity to what you're asking, right? So you can still add your own questions. And like I said, these are going to help you explore and analyze the data with a purpose, right? They're going to be your starting point, and you're going to use them as your guide to help find a story. So usually I will start with a question, and I will make some charts, see where it leads, see what trends I find. Sometimes you don't find anything, right? That's okay. Sometimes a question will lead to a dead end. But typically, while you're exploring a couple of these questions, you may find something else interesting going on. So you need to follow the data. Follow it where it takes you. It might not be where you expect it to go, right? You might be on a little detour, but that's not bad, right? You might start off trying to answer one question and answer something completely different, right? But follow the data where it leads. And look for outliers. I know outliers are obnoxious, right? We have this nice, beautiful trend right here, and then you've got this smug outlier over here doing its own thing, right? It doesn't care about your trends. It messes up your averages. Can we just ignore it? No, don't do that. I know we want to, but a lot of times, the best stories you're going to find in your data are in those outliers, right? So make sure you're digging in and paying attention to them. And if you don't believe me, my Iron Viz was 3 outliers, right? These 3 people were doing something different than everyone else in the data, and that became a very interesting story to tell. So I'm actually going to walk you through what this process looked like for this Iron Viz in terms of some questions that I generated and how they led me here. It was actually kind of fun. I took a little trip down memory lane and was digging up all my Iron Viz notes for this. And I had like 30 questions listed out. I'm going to show you just a couple. One was, does curiosity and Shazam correlate with YouTube views? I thought, maybe people hear music out in the wild, they Shazam it, and then they go watch the music video on YouTube. I was curious if there were different genres being Shazammed around the world. Maybe there were some cool regional trends. I thought maybe there were cities or regions that caught on to new music first, right? They were kind of the epicenter of popular music. And then I was curious about the diversity of the top songs and artists, right? Is it always Taylor Swift? How do you knock her out of the top, right? Notice that none of these questions say, who were the breakthrough artists in this time? But the question that led me there is this one. Are there cities and regions that catch on to new music first? In my head, I was thinking, yeah, there might be a city and a new song sparks, and you can see the popularity pulsed out from there around the world. Wouldn't that be so cool? Yeah, it probably would have been, but it's not what was in the data, right? What was in the data was 3 artists' songs catching on like wildfire all over the place, right? So it became less about trend-setting cities and became more about trend-setting artists. So that's an example of where you may not end up where you started, and that is okay, right? Find the story in your data. And then, once you have that story, it is time to determine how you're going to visually convey it to your audience. And so you need to generate some charts. You need to pick some effective visuals. And the name of the game here is iterate. Make as many charts as you can possibly think of, right? Avoid the urge to just make a bar chart and go with it. Because it might work for your data, but it might not be the best chart for your data, right? And you're not going to know that unless you try other charts. Right? If you were in the market for a new car, I doubt you would go into one dealership and test drive one car and buy it, right? No, you'd probably test drive a lot of cars, see which one works best, which ones you like the best. Same thing here. You got to test drive a lot of charts before you land on the final one to see which one tells your story the best. I'm going to show you some examples of this from my Iron Viz feeder. So this is the Viz that got me into Iron Viz. And I looked at all the lip syncs in RuPaul's Drag Race, and I analyzed the different elements that queens were doing. So I had this section, and I thought, how are winning and losing lip syncs differing from each other? So I did start with the bar chart, right? That's where we all go when we need to compare something. And it was pretty meh. It didn't have a lot of flair. So I tried to give it some. I didn't like that, because then you're really hard to compare the two. I did a bar in bar. This was kind of getting there, but it was just still kind of meh. I did a dumbbell chart, and I did a whole bunch of others. And I remember feeling stuck. And whenever that happens, whenever I'm stuck and I just don't know which way to go, I do two things. One, I will go to a chart catalog of some type, right? There's tons out there. And a lot of them you can look at charts by function. So if you know you need to compare something, it'll give you a list of 15 charts that will help you determine how you want to compare it. So test drive those charts, right? Find one that's going to work for it. The second thing I do is I go back and I say, what question was I trying to answer again? Because a lot of times I forget, right? We're in the weeds, we're analyzing the data, we're generating charts, and you can lose sight of what you're actually trying to answer. So go back and say, what question was I trying to answer with that chart? And usually those two things will help me get to my final chart. And in this case, for the RuPaul Viz, it was a radar chart, which is never going to be the first chart that I test drive, but it's where I landed, right? I kind of treated lip syncing as a sport, which I like. This is a very common sport chart. It displayed a lot of metrics at one time, and I could always see that the losing lip sync was inside the area of the winning lip sync. So this is where I ended up through that iterative process. The other thing I want to talk about with selecting charts is make sure that they're supporting your analysis and your story. I think a lot of times we can feel pressured to use non-standard chart types, right? Kind of these eye candy charts that look really cool. But a lot of times those charts actually hide our story. They make it more difficult for a user to find the story and answer the question, right? So you want to make sure you're not doing that. At work, I would say never do this, right? Never use non-standard charts at work. Use the ones that people understand quickly, because they're coming to your dashboards for quick insights, right? In the more creative arena, though, you might want to use something more eye-catching. But again, just make sure it answers the question, because a lot of times a simple chart done well is going to be more effective than those non-standard charts. And again, looking at that RuPaul Viz, I had a section where I wanted to see what lip sync had the most elements in it. And I made this, and I was feeling pretty pleased with myself. I was like, look at this radial, I figured out this trig, look how cool it is. And then I went back and I said, which lip sync has the most elements? I don't know, right? That's a problem. If you can't answer your question with the chart, it's the wrong chart. And I put easily in parentheses here, because you could probably find that answer there, but you want the answer to jump off the page for your user, right? So I shifted gears, and I stepped back, and I ironed out the radial, and I went a little bit simpler. I added a line chart to the top so that you could really quickly see, this is the lip sync with the most elements, right? So make sure that you are not just going with something complex and eye-catching because you think, this is really cool, right? People are going to like it. Make sure that it does tell your story and support your analysis. And now, let's make everything look good. So step 5 is a bit of a doozy, so I hope you have some gas left in the tank, because this is where we're going to spend the majority of our time, right? I will say, there is no way for me to talk about every facet of design in the time we have left. I'm going to talk to you about the main things that I take into consideration throughout my process. And the first one is getting inspired. So there is not a single project that I start without first finding inspiration, both in the creative and work arena. And what I do is I spend a lot of time on Pinterest, on Behance, on Tableau Public, on Dribbble, just to get ideas. And once I find something that I like, I steal it. But I steal it like an artist. So this is very important. We don't want to take other people's work and take credit for it, right? We don't want to copy people. We want to be our own, right? We want to make it our own. So you can find inspiration in other people's work, but make sure you're putting a little spin on it, right? Remixing it to be your own. So here's an example from a viz I did on Breaking Bad. And these are 2 images that I found when I was looking for inspiration. And I liked the one with the icons because it was kind of playful, like these playful icons. They looked cool. But I liked the one on the right because of the kind of tone that it was setting, right? It's like, OK, we're going to go out to the desert and we're going to cook. And so what I did was I remixed it, and I made this, right? So you can see there's obvious inspiration from these two images, right? But it's not a direct copy, where I'm taking elements from different ones, the color palette, the scene, some of the icon styles, and making it my own, right? So that's what I mean when I say to steal like an artist. The other thing with design is we want to have a plan, right? You want to chart your route before you hit the road. So let's wireframe. This is something I used to skip all the time when I first started, because I would think, I got my charts, I'm going to throw them on a dashboard, it'll come together, it's fine. Don't do that. Don't skip this. You want to have a plan in place. It does not have to be some complex wireframe, and for me, it often isn't. I keep things very simple. There's never any color. There's never any real data. And I am a sketcher, right? I just like to make a really quick sketch of something so that I have an idea of where it's going to go, right? Because if you have that plan in place, your design's going to come together a lot faster when you go to put it together. And like I said, this is not a place I spend a lot of time. My desk is littered with pieces of paper that look like this, right? I just went to this stack for this presentation. I took some pictures and threw them up here. Every single one of these became a real viz or dashboard at work, right? So just proof, you do not have to spend tons of time. I know some people do make more high fidelity wireframes, and that's fine. Do what works for you, but it does not have to be a very time-consuming step, but you should plan your route. And then we want to make it look good. So aesthetics, I think, is what most people think of when they think of design, right? So here we're going to talk about color, text, icons, and images, and I'm going to give you some examples of all those. With color, color is probably the most powerful tool that we have as analysts to draw people's focus, but it's also really easy to veer off course with color. One thing that I used to do all the time is I would just use way too much color, right? The more color we use, the less power color holds to grab someone's attention. So you want to make sure you're using it sparingly. So this is an example of a chart I probably would have made when I first started at Miracosta. This kind of colorful spaghetti chart showing course success rates over time in different subjects before and after COVID. And I've told the user what the story is in the title. I have said, success in math has decreased since COVID while success in English has increased. That is really hard to find in that chart because there's too much color, right? You have to find, okay, which one is English in the legend? It's yellow. Where's math? It's brown. Then I got to map it back onto that colorful spaghetti. It's really hard. That's not a quick thing to see. If you use color more sparingly, you gray out those supporting characters in your story, and you put the high beams on the ones that matter, all of a sudden that story pops. It's very easy for your user to see, oh yeah, those two courses are really diverging since COVID. What's going on there? And then once you use color, you have given it meaning. So when you do give color meaning, make sure you keep that meaning consistent. Because I told the user here, orange means something is decreasing, and blue means something is increasing. So I don't want to then turn around in this dashboard and do this and say enrollment's going up, but it's in orange. That's really confusing. That adds to the cognitive load on your user. Cognitive load is just a mental effort that it takes someone to understand something, and we don't want a lot of it for our users. So make sure you keep the color meaning consistent throughout your dashboards and your Vizzes. The other thing you want to do is you want to find an appropriate color palette. So there's actually a whole psychology of color where different colors evoke different feelings and emotions in us. So if I was doing a Viz about, I don't know, birthday popularity, I wouldn't use muted, sad, drab colors, right? No, I'd use happy colors, right? I'd use these fun pinks and pops of yellow because those invoke feelings of playfulness and happiness. Yellow is often the most joyful color. So make sure you're leveraging that, right? Because the color palette's going to set a tone. So you want it to be on message with your story and the theme of your Viz. And then lastly with color, we want to make sure we're thinking about keeping it accessible, right? This usually means color contrast, making sure something is easy to see and read, and also color blindness. There are multiple forms of color blindness. The most common is red-green color blindness. So somebody with that form of color blindness would see this stoplight palette like this, right? That red and green are basically impossible to tell apart there. So you want to avoid this, or you want to put your color palettes through simulators for color blindness and contrast checking. But some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's great, but red and green are in my brand. Like, I have to use these. It's not an option. If that's the case, if you're ever in a situation where you do have to use these, make sure you double encode them. So apply some other visual indicator to let your user know that something is going up or down, like a shape, like a line pattern, just anything to add more meaning. There's also something kind of nifty you can do in Tableau where you let your user take the wheel and let them pick. Say if they are affected by color blindness, let them choose which palette they want to use. And you can do this with just a Boolean parameter on color. There's a resource in that QR code up top. But then you're allowing your user to select and kind of doing a more universal design. OK, let's move on to text. Text is interesting because it is part of the aesthetic design, but it is also part of the functional design, which means your user has to be able to read it, right? They need to be able to get meaning out of your text. So you don't want to make it too small for them to read or too light, like I was talking about that contrast before. You don't want to get too cute with your fonts, right? That's too far. That has gone too artistic in the font department. And speaking of fonts, you want to pick an appropriate one, right? Because your font is going to tell a story and send a message over and above what the words actually say, right? Just like color, there's a whole psychology behind fonts as well, where serifs make us feel a certain way, sans serifs make us feel a certain way, scripts do something, right? So make sure you're leveraging those, right? Leveraging that psychology of font, picking a font that tells the story and supports the story that you were trying to relay to your user. And then it's also helpful to establish a hierarchy with your text. So you all may have seen images like this, and as you're reading it, you're thinking, Lisa's a mind reader. No, I do not have psychic abilities. What I have is a text hierarchy, right? A hierarchy brings some sense of organization to your Vizzes, and it allows you to draw focus to the important things first, right? Those KPIs can be big and bold, where more supportive information can be smaller and less bold, right? So keeping that in mind is really helpful, again, when we think about cognitive load, right? Creating more digestible chunks of information for your user to read. OK, let's move on to icons, and that's next in our aesthetics. Icons, the main thing I like to think about is keeping them consistent. You will find tons of icon libraries out there for you to pull from, and they're probably all going to have different styles, right? Different stroke widths, filled and unfilled, and just kind of different styles in general. It doesn't really matter which one you end up using. Just keep it consistent. If you use a filled icon, don't use an unfilled icon somewhere else, right? Make sure they're cohesive and consistent to bring that cohesion to your Viz. You also want to use icons sparingly. An icon is going to draw focus, and anything that's on your Viz drawing focus away from your data, you don't want to put too much of. So make sure that they have a purpose and a real job to do in your Viz before you use an icon. And then just like fonts, don't get too cute. Don't get too creative when you are making icons. Keep them familiar and intuitive to your user so they don't have to think about it. They see a home icon and they know this is going to take me to my home page, right? You don't want them to have to think. And then lastly with aesthetics, let's talk about images. Images are one of the harder things to use in visualizations because they're such attention hogs, right? Those images are going to grab a lot of focus. So make sure if you do put an image in your Viz, it's enhancing, not detracting from your data. And there are 3 things that I usually do to achieve this. 1, I keep the image pretty simple and relevant to my story and my topic. I like to add some transparency to help mute images down a little bit so they're a little bit less of a focal point. And I like to make them match the color scheme, right? The color palette that we spent time picking before, I like for it to look more seamless, right? So make sure the image is in that color palette. So let's take a look at the image I used for Iron Viz, right? This is from a sound studio. I picked this image, I liked it. Didn't really match my color palette though, right? I had already decided I'm using these colors for Iron Viz, like for my 3 artists. So what was I going to do, right? Because I still wanted to use this image. I just changed the image. So I originally tweaked this in Photoshop, and when I was recreating it for this presentation, I found this free Light X Studio. With just a couple tweaks on the dial, I was able to put this in line with my color palette, right? So this is going to be much more cohesive. I know this is relevant, but it's not quite as simple as I wanted. So what did I do? I added transparency, right? That helps bring some subtleness to the image and make it less of a focal point. And then you can see it all together in the Iron Viz over here, where it is there creating some visual interest, but it is not hogging all the attention away from the data, right? It's there, and it's enhancing, not detracting from the data. OK, next up, let's talk about function, because functionality is absolutely part of design, right? This is more like the user interface or the user experience, or UI and UX. It's basically everything your user is interacting with or touching to get information off of your dashboards and your Vizzes. So every tooltip, every mouse click, every drop down, every scroll, all of that is going to be part of the functionality. And there are ways to enhance the functionality, right? Make it a little bit more seamless for your users. I'm going to show you an example of that from that RuPaul Viz again. This was a section I had that showcased all the things that all the queens were doing. And I just had them in this big scrolly box. So they're just scroll, scroll, scroll. It does function, but it's a little bit clunky. It could be enhanced and it could be better. And luckily, I took my Viz to an Iron Viz feedback session that Sarah Bartlett organizes every year. And Chantilly Juggernaut was there, and she said, that's fine, but why don't you make it a carousel? And if Chantilly Juggernaut tells you to do something, you do it. And she was right? This is what it had looked like as a carousel, where now it's much more interactive and engaging for a user. They're clicking through the pages rather than just scrolling through this giant chart. And it's creating more digestible chunks of information, again, reducing that cognitive load on my user. I really love to enhance functionality in Tableau. I have a dashboard and a companion blog post all about how to do things like carousels and accordion menus and tabs so that you can go beyond the default design elements and UI in Tableau if you're looking for ideas. And then lastly, let's talk about clutter. Clutter is the nemesis of data visualization because, as I've talked about, everything that goes onto a Viz or a dashboard grabs focus and takes attention. So you want to make sure that everything on there has a purpose. A good rule of thumb is if I can understand this chart without this thing, you should get rid of it. So grid lines, extra decimal places, long labels, big heavy text things. Anything that's not adding value or adding to your user's ability to understand, you can get rid of it. It's also helpful to add white space, right? You might have heard this as let your data breathe, right? Give it room so that your user's not inundated with information, right? Give it some room to breathe. Because again, the goal here, reduce cognitive load. The more effort your user has to spend on your dashboards and your Vizzes to get information, the less they're probably going to take away because they don't want to spend that time. And then with all of these components, there's one thing that I'm always thinking about with design, and that is, does it support my analysis and my story? You've kind of heard me talk about it throughout, but all those color choices, font choices, icons, images, they all tell a story. Make sure it's on message, that it matches the story that you want to tell with this data. All right, we have hit the end of the road. We are on step 6. Let's polish this up. Let's get feedback and QA. You absolutely want to build time in your projects for this, right? Getting feedback is crucial because you're too close to things to see issues or see things in a different way. Get feedback from multiple groups of people. Analysts, people in the data fam are going to have a great perspective in terms of analytics, Tableau, things like that. But lay people are really helpful too, because they'll tell you, I didn't know what to do here. That functionality wasn't obvious, right? So make sure you're talking to multiple types of groups. Oops, I gave that away. Some people, I used to think this way, if I ask someone for feedback, that I have to take it. No, you don't have to take it, right? It's your Viz. You are in the driver's seat. You want to make sure that this Viz or this dashboard is going to represent your work well. So make sure that you agree with everything you're putting out there. Now, if 5 people tell you the same thing, you should probably take it, right? Don't ignore the road signs telling you there's a cliff ahead, right? But ultimately, it is your Viz. So make sure that you agree with what you're putting out there. And then you want to make sure you do some quality assurance. Shout out to one of my QA queens here, Maria Litzner, my other QA queen, Kim Coots at work. There's nothing that I do at work that they don't check my analysis, my calculations, all my functionality, filters, parameters, actions, navigation, you name it, typos and grammars. Because if you put something out there that doesn't work or has issues that are obvious, users lose trust in your data and your analysis. And you don't want that to happen, right? So make sure that you are doing a round of QA. And with that, we've come to the end of the, oh, what is that? That's a roadblock to my unofficial 7th step, which is to publish this. I say unofficial because you just did all that work. Of course you're going to publish it, right? It's implied. At work, yeah, you are going to publish it or you're probably going to lose your job. But When it comes to more creative things, right, things you're putting on Tableau Public, I often find there is a huge roadblock here, for myself included, typically in the form of perfection, right? This has to be perfect, or this isn't good enough, or I'm not good enough, or this didn't turn out how I wanted it to, so I'm not going to put it out there. Well, newsflash, it's never going to be perfect, right? And no one expects it to be perfect. Do not let perfect be the enemy of the good here. Because when you focus on the process you went through, right, things like, did I learn something? Did I grow my Tableau skills? Did I have fun doing this? That's what you should focus on, right? Not if it's perfect. Focus on finishing it rather than perfecting it. Because when you start putting your work out there, that's when you start to grow. That's when you start to get better, and you start to see your skills enhance and grow as well. So like I said, no one expects it to be perfect. Don't put that expectation on yourself. And when you start thinking that way, then you can break through that roadblock and drive off into the sunset, right, with a process from going from that blank workbook to a more polished visualization. Again, I just want to say thank you all so much for being here. We have a few minutes left for questions. If anyone has any now, or if you want to just come up to me after, we can chat that way too. As promised, here's that QR code of resources for all the things that I talked about today. And I know some people are taking pictures, so I'll just say it. There's also a survey. Please take the survey. I read all of your feedback so that I can get better at this. So thank you again.